I was sitting alone in the living room when my daughter-in-law walked in and turned off my oxygen machine, laughing. "You seem fine to me." I gasped for air as she whispered, "Maybe it's time you let go." My son walked in, took one look, and said, "Don't exaggerate." That night, I left a backup tape on his desk that revealed everything, but what he did next made her drop to the floor when I drew one slow breath. That was all I had time for before the room went wrong. The hum of my oxygen machine had been a constant companion for 3 years, steady, reliable, the quiet heartbeat of my survival. I had learned to sleep through it, eat beside it, read my old teaching journals with its rhythm in my ears. That afternoon, I was sitting in the wingback chair by the window, watching the oak tree drop its leaves in slow spirals, when Myra walked through the living room door. She did not knock, she never knocked anymore. "You seem fine to me," she said, with that soft, almost musical laugh she always used when she wanted to sound harmless. And then her hand moved quick, casual, like she was adjusting a lamp, and the machine clicked off. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. My chest tightened instantly, the way a fist closes around a coin. The tubing from my nose suddenly felt like empty decoration. I reached for it anyway, fingers trembling, and my voice came out in pieces. "Please turn it back on." A pause while my lungs burned. "Please." Myra leaned down toward me, not to help. She leaned close the way a person leans in to read the fine print on a contract, her face smooth and unreadable, her perfume too sweet for a moment this cold. "Maybe," she whispered, and her voice had almost no feeling in it at all, "it's time you let go." I could feel my vision begin to blur at the edges. The oak tree outside blurred into a smear of orange and brown. My hands were clutching the arms of the chair, knuckles white, and I was fighting to stay focused, fighting to breathe, fighting to not let her see how afraid I was. Then the front door opened. Daniel walked in. My son, 38 years old, tie loosened, face set in the tight expression he wore like a second skin. He stopped when he saw me. He saw the machine was off. I watched his eyes take in the scene, me trembling, me gasping, Myra standing close. "Don't exaggerate," he said, and he dropped his keys on the table with a heavy metallic clatter and walked toward the kitchen. I could not speak, every breath I attempted came up short. Myra reached over slowly, almost ceremonially, and turned the machine back on. The hum returned, air came back, but something else had left the room and would not return. She straightened up and smiled at me, that sweet, practiced smile. "Accidents happen in old houses," she said pleasantly, as though she had just commented on the weather. "I am Lydia Ashford. I spent 31 years as a school principal, shaping classrooms, managing budgets, reading the character of every teacher, student, and parent who crossed my threshold. I have always believed I could read people. That belief, that certainty, is my greatest strength and my most dangerous flaw. I became obsessive when I felt wronged. I gathered evidence compulsively, replayed conversations in my mind until they lost their shape, turned small details into enormous structures. I had done it in my career. I had done it in my marriage. And now, lying in that wingback chair with oxygen flowing back into my failing lungs, I felt the familiar switch flip on inside me, and I knew I would not stop until I had the truth documented, witnessed, and undeniable. Daniel was my son, but he was not an easy man to reach. Years of grinding work had built a wall around him, brick by careful brick. He trusted Myra the way tired people trust routine, not because they have examined it carefully, but because examining it takes energy they cannot spare. Myra understood this perfectly. She was 35, calm as still water, and just as difficult to read beneath the surface. She had married into this house 4 years ago, and in those 4 years she had slowly, methodically made herself the center of it. That night, trembling under my quilt, I stared at the ceiling and faced the truth. This was not carelessness. Careless people fumble, apologize, look surprised at the damage they cause. Myra had leaned in. Myra had whispered. Myra had planned the exact words she would use and the exact distance she would stand from me when she said them. And Daniel, my Daniel, had called it exaggeration and walked to the kitchen to find his dinner. I lay still for a long time. Then I reached for the small digital recorder I had kept from my teaching days, a habit I never broke, because meetings and conferences had taught me that memory is unreliable but recording is not. I pressed the button and spoke into it quietly, describing every detail of what had happened, the time, the words, the expression on her face, the sound of Daniel's keys landing on the table. I described the sound of the machine going silent. I described Myra's perfume. I described the exact sentence she had whispered. Then I set the recorder on my nightstand, turned off my lamp, and made myself a promise. I was going to be more careful than I had ever been in my life, because I was not dealing with a careless person. I was dealing with a deliberate one. The next morning I woke early, deliberately, obsessively early, while the house was still gray and quiet. I sat up slowly, waited for the dizziness to pass, and then I began. My old teaching recorder could capture sound from across a room if the room was quiet enough. I had used it to document meetings with difficult parents, with dishonest staff members, with district officials who later denied the promises they had made. I knew exactly how to position it. I slid it under the lip of the bookshelf in the living room where it was completely invisible, angled toward the couch where Myra usually sat in the mornings while Daniel was in the shower. I also had a phone, an older model my granddaughter had given me before she moved abroad. Myra did not know I used it because I had always been careful to use it only in my room. I set up a second recording application on it. 2 devices, 2 backups. If Myra had taught me anything, it was that single points of failure were dangerous. 3 days passed, I watched and listened. My flaw, the obsessive quality that had always lived inside me, began to show its teeth. I replayed recordings from those 3 days dozens of times, straining to hear undertones that might not have existed, building timelines on notepads, cross-referencing the timing of events against patterns I thought I noticed. I was not sleeping enough. I was eating barely enough. I was circling closer and closer to a kind of frantic edge that I recognized from old arguments in my marriage. From the worst years of professional conflict, I knew this state. I had to keep it from consuming me. One morning Myra sat on the couch with her phone and I heard her murmuring into it from my position at the hallway entrance. I caught fragments. She complains constantly, and Daniel is starting to agree with me that she needs. And then a laugh low and private. She won't last long anyway, honestly. I stood very still in the hallway and made myself breathe through my nose slowly, the way I had trained myself to breathe since the oxygen machine had become necessary. I went back to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed. My hands were shaking not from weakness but from rage. The obsessive part of my mind wanted to walk into the living room and set the recorder on the coffee table and say, "Here, explain this, explain your voice saying those words." But I forced myself to be still. I needed more. I needed the kind of evidence that could not be explained away as selective editing, as mishearing, as misunderstanding. I wrote in my notepad, "Not yet." I underlined it twice. A week after the oxygen incident, something happened with my medication. I took a blood pressure pill each morning at 7 white tablets in a small orange bottle. I had been careful with them for 2 years, same time, same shelf, same routine. That morning the bottle was empty. I stared at it for a long moment. I had filled it 6 days earlier, a 30-day supply. I went carefully through my memory, which was still sharp despite everything, and I could account for 6 pills. 6 days at 1 pill a day, 24 pills were missing. I did not say anything to Daniel or Myra. I ordered a replacement through the pharmacy and had it delivered. But I wrote the incident down with the date, time, and the bottle count, and I placed the empty bottle in the locked drawer of my nightstand along with my recorder. Evidence. Everything was evidence. My struggle during this period was real, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. There were nights when I genuinely could not tell if I was building a case or building a story. My obsessive nature has always blurred that line. In my professional years, I had sometimes been wrong about people, had built elaborate theories about motives that turned out to be incomplete, had connected dots that were not connected. I lay awake asking myself, am I being accurate or am I being afraid, and turning fear into a case file because case files feel like control? I went back to the recordings. I listened to Myra's voice. "Maybe it's time you let go." There was no ambiguity in that sentence. There was no innocent interpretation of leaning close to a woman who could not breathe and whispering that phrase. I was not building a story. I was documenting a real one. Daniel was the problem I had not fully solved. He moved through the house in a kind of fog, coming home late, eating in near silence, watching the news with the fixed expression of a man who has decided that if he stops moving he will have to think. He had always been this way in times of stress, retreating inward, becoming suspicious of anything that felt like added complication, defaulting to the path of least resistance. Myra was the path of least resistance. She was smooth and organized and managed the house without apparent effort, and she always had a quiet, reasonable explanation for every concern Daniel might have raised. "She's just trying to control you," I overheard her telling him one evening when they thought I was asleep. Her voice was gentle, even sympathetic. "I know she's your mother and you love her, but look at this objectively. Every time you seem settled, she creates a new crisis. That's a pattern, Daniel." There was silence from Daniel. Then, "She looked really bad that day with the machine." "She did, but she also recovered immediately and Dr. Huang said her levels were stable at the last appointment. I'm just saying, sometimes anxiety can make symptoms feel more severe than they are." Another silence. Then Daniel said in the flat tone of a man convincing himself, "Yeah, I know." I was lying in the hallway, dark, my back against the wall, my recorder running in my hand. I made myself breathe. I made myself wait. The night I decided to escalate, I was sitting at my desk with my notepad and I realized I had enough. Myra on the oxygen machine, Myra on the phone call, Myra managing Daniel's perception of me with careful, soft language. What I did not have was something that would stop Daniel's fog in its tracks, something so clear and immediate that no amount of reasonable explanation could dissolve it. I thought about this for a long time, and then I made a decision that my obsessive, methodical nature probably made inevitable. I copied the original oxygen recording onto my phone, and I placed the phone, set to play automatically at the tap of a button, face down on Daniel's desk beneath a single page from my notepad. The page said only, "Play me." I did not confront him. I went back to my room and I waited. The obsessive part of me wanted to stand outside his office door. I sat on my bed instead and folded my hands and made myself think of other things, of classrooms, of 31 years of complicated people navigating complicated problems, of the fact that most of the time the truth was patient and the liar was not. 2 days passed, then 3. I began to doubt the plan. Maybe he had not seen the phone. Maybe Myra had found it first. My mind started spinning up worst-case scenarios, each one more elaborate than the last, and I had to physically write them down and then write stop at the bottom of the page just to drain them out of my head. This is what obsession feels like from the inside, not dramatic, not cinematic, just exhausting. Just an engine that does not know how to turn itself off. On the 4th day, I heard the recording from down the hallway. The hum of the oxygen machine, so familiar it had become background, then the click as it stopped, then my own voice, thin and desperate, "Please turn it back on." And then Myra's voice, close and cold and completely unmistakable, "Maybe it's time you let go." I got up, I moved down the hallway slowly, one hand on the wall, and I stopped at the doorway of Daniel's home office. He was sitting at the desk with the phone in his hands. His face had gone the color of old paper. His mouth was slightly open. He was staring at the phone the way you stare at something you cannot make sense of, as though staring harder might reveal that what you heard was not what you heard. Then I heard Myra's voice from behind me. She had come in from the kitchen. "That's edited," she said, and her voice was still smooth, still practiced, but there was something new underneath it, a hairline crack like the first sign of fracture in something that had seemed solid. I turned to look at her. She was standing in the doorway. And for the first time in 4 years, I saw something real on her face, not the performance, but the performer calculating very fast. "That's edited," she said again, more firmly. "You can do anything with audio software now." She's been. "I didn't just record that one," I said. She stopped. "I have been recording for 3 weeks, I said. "I have the phone call where you told someone I won't last long anyway. I have the morning you moved my medication. I have 6 recordings of you reframing events to Daniel in ways that contradicted what actually happened. I have all of it." Daniel stood up slowly. He turned to look at Myra and his expression had shifted entirely. The fog was gone. What replaced it was something rawer and more complicated, the look of someone who has been carefully managed and has just understood with complete clarity that they have been managed. "Tell me it isn't true," he said. Myra's gaze moved rapidly between us. I could see her thinking, recalculating. She had been caught in a corner and she was looking for a door. "You're going to believe her over me?" Her voice went sharp. "Daniel, she is manipulative. She has always been manipulative. Your whole life she has controlled you and you can't even see it because you grew up in it. I have spent 4 years protecting you from." "From what?" Daniel said. His voice was very quiet. That quietness was worse than shouting. "From my mother. You turned off her oxygen. That's on the recording. I heard your voice." "It was a mistake. I didn't realize what it was. I thought it was a..." "You whispered it was time for her to let go," Daniel said, into her face while she couldn't breathe. Myra moved, not toward either of us. She moved toward the desk, fast and sudden, and she knocked the phone off it. It skidded across the floor and hit the baseboard. In the same movement, she reached for the notepad beside the desk and Daniel grabbed her wrist. "Don't," he said. She twisted away from him, and for a moment I thought she might actually leave the room, leave the house, leave all of it, vanish before the full weight of what was happening could land. But she didn't. She stood in the center of the room, her chest rising and falling rapidly, and something broke open in her expression. Not guilt, something more like fury, the fury of someone who has built something very carefully and watched it collapse. And then she laughed. It was not a laugh I had ever heard from her before. It had no performance in it. It was breathless and fractured and startling in a room this quiet. "You think she's innocent?" Myra's voice was raw now, all the smoothness stripped away. "Ask her why your father really died." The room went completely still. Daniel's grip on her wrist loosened. He turned slowly to look at me. I felt the words land like something physical. I kept my expression as steady as I could, but I could feel my heart beating very fast, and I knew what she was referencing. The secret I had kept for a long time, the thing I had told myself, was buried. "What is she talking about?" Daniel said. "She's trying to redirect," I said, and my voice was steady even though my hands were not. "She's doing exactly what she does. She's throwing something at you to make you look away from her." "That doesn't answer the question," Daniel said. Myra sat down on the floor, not collapsing, not falling, but sitting deliberately, as though she had decided the ground was the safest place. She looked up at me from there, and her expression was something I had never expected to see on her face, naked and exhausted and stripped of all calculation. "Tell him," she said. "Tell him what you told me the night you'd had too much wine at the anniversary dinner 3 years ago. Tell him what you said about his father." I do not know what I expected from that moment. I had expected the confrontation to go differently. I had spent 3 weeks planning it, preparing it, controlling it. But this was the thing my obsessive nature had failed to account for: that Myra had been gathering information too. That she had been watching me the way I watched her, finding my vulnerabilities, storing them the way I stored mine. "Mom," Daniel said, and in that one word there was everything: the exhaustion and the grief and the confusion and the love. "What happened with Dad?" I sat down in the chair near the door. I was tired in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with my oxygen levels. "Your father was ill for a long time before he died," I said. "You know that. What you don't know is that he asked me more than once in the last months to help him end it sooner. And the night he died, I did not call the ambulance as quickly as I could have." I paused. "I waited, not long, but I waited, and I have lived with that choice for 9 years. Silence, the kind that takes up all the space in a room." Daniel sat down on the edge of the desk. He put his face in his hands. "I'm not confessing to a crime," I said, because I needed him to understand the full shape of it. "I'm confessing to a choice that I made for a man who was suffering, who had asked me to let him go, and who I believed I was honoring. I have asked myself every day whether I was right. I still do not have a clean answer." "She was waiting to use that," Myra said from the floor, and now she sounded simply tired, the anger drained out. "She told me in a moment when she thought I was her ally. I've held it for 3 years. I wasn't always trying to hurt you," she said, and this was directed at me with something that may have been the closest she had ever come to honesty. "I was trying to protect my position. I was afraid of you. You're the most formidable person in this house, and you barely have the strength to stand, and I was afraid of you." I looked at her on the floor. This woman who had turned off my oxygen and whispered that it was time to let go. This woman who had managed my son's perception of me with expert patience. And underneath all of that, apparently, fear. Fear of a 72-year-old woman in a wingback chair with a breathing machine. "You should have been," I said, and I did not mean it cruelly. I meant it as information. The rest of that night moved in a kind of fractured sequence. Daniel made phone calls. Myra packed a bag in silence. There was no dramatic scene at the door. She simply walked out the next morning with 2 suitcases and got into a car that must have been called ahead of time, and she did not look back at the house. Daniel stood at the window and watched, and I sat at the kitchen table and held my coffee cup and did not watch because I had already seen enough. The consequences unfolded in waves over the following weeks. Daniel contacted a family attorney, and the recordings, all of them cleaned and timestamped, became part of a legal consultation that I will not detail fully here, but which involved conversations about elder abuse and the turning off of medical equipment. Daniel also spoke to my doctor, who confirmed that shutting off my oxygen for even a short period carried real risk given my condition. There were formal records filed. Myra hired her own attorney. For several weeks, the silence between Daniel and me in the house was thick with everything that had been said and everything that had not yet been fully processed. My flaw made the aftermath harder than it needed to be. I could not stop analyzing. I went back through every recording, not because I needed to, but because the engine in my mind would not stop running. I dissected the timeline of Myra's behavior, looking for the earliest moment she had decided to go from merely managing the household dynamic to actively endangering me. I cross-referenced conversations. I built chronologies on 3 separate notepads. It was not healthy. I knew it was not healthy. I did it anyway. Daniel said to me one evening, about 3 weeks after Myra had gone, "You're still going through all of it, aren't you?" "Yes," I said. "You need to stop." "I know." "Mom." He sat down across from me. He looked older than 38. He looked like a man who had been taken apart and put back together slightly differently. "I believe you, about Myra, about everything. You don't have to keep proving it." I set down my notepad. "I know," I said again, and then, because I owed him this, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about your father sooner. I convinced myself I was protecting you. I think I was also protecting myself." He was quiet for a long time. He was in so much pain, he finally said. "Every single day." Did he know at the end that you? Yes, I said, he knew. Another long silence. Then Daniel said, okay, and he did not say anything else about it, and I understood that he was choosing to hold that knowledge the same way I had, carefully, privately, and with the full weight of its complexity. Recordings of Myra's phone call and her careful reframing of events made their way into the legal process through proper channels. I will not say what the outcome was in full because some of it is still not entirely resolved, but I will say that the woman who had come into my home and tested whether I was willing to simply stop existing was no longer in a position to make those tests. She was gone from the house, gone from Daniel's daily life, and faced with a paper trail that her own words had built. What I carry now, sitting in the wingback chair by the window watching the oak tree do what oak trees do in the cold months, is something more complicated than victory. I have my oxygen machine humming. I have my son in the next room, occasionally difficult and still prone to retreating inward, but present in a way he had not been while Myra was here. I have my notepads, still filled with observations I am slowly training myself not to make, slowly learning to sit with uncertainty instead of trying to document it into control. My obsession served me in this case. I am honest enough to admit that. Without it I would not have had the recordings, would not have had the timeline, would not have had anything concrete enough to cut through Daniel's fog. But obsession is a tool that does not know how to set itself down, and the months since that confrontation have involved real effort to put it away, to breathe, to trust that the truth has already done its work. The unexpected twist of this whole story, the thing I did not plan for and could not have, is that Myra's revelation about Daniel's father ultimately changed something between my son and me that the recordings alone never could have. The recordings proved that I was in danger. The revelation proved that I was human. Daniel could accept a mother who had protected herself with a recorder. He needed something more before he could accept a mother who had made an impossible choice in a dark room 9 years ago and had lived with it in silence. What Myra had intended as a weapon became, in the end, a door, not an easy door, not a painless one, but a real one that we had both needed to walk through. I breathe every breath now as a deliberate thing. The machine hums. The oak tree is bare now, its branches making dark angles against a pale sky, and I watch it every morning from my chair. I am not at peace in any simple way, peace was never really my nature. But I am still here, I documented the truth, I made it undeniable, and for a woman of 72 in a wingback chair with no allies and a body that requires mechanical assistance to stay alive, I believe that is enough. More than enough.